Let's see here. Jen, it looks like there's still some people in the waiting room. Are you able to admit them?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. There we go. Okay, it looks like everyone's been admitted from the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is session IC 61, working with users to develop active mobility strategies to improve community mobility. I'm Ellen Teasley. I'm going to be moderating this session. Just a reminder, as with all the other presentations, I'll provide the CEU code at the end. I'll say it verbally and I'll type it into the chat. You should have been muted when you were admitted from the waiting room, but please just double check now that you are in fact muted. The presenter, Mike, would like to kind of keep this as a engaging sort of presentation. So go ahead and type questions into the chat as you come up with them, and I will read them off for Mike. And I believe that is also, go ahead and turn it over. Mike, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining me. And as Ellen mentioned, absolutely open to getting questions as we go along the way. In fact, I would encourage it because I have a very bad memory. And if you ask me something from well in the past of my presentation, I may not recall exactly the context. So feel free. And so my talk today is it's sort of an opening conversation about what can be done with clients that you may have that are either, say, fresh out of or preparing to even leave, say, rehabilitation to go back to a place where they already live, or maybe it's somewhere new, or maybe they're just moving in general, or even if they're planning on a trip somewhere, say vacation. Hopefully some of the things that we'll talk and discuss will allow people to make sort of better decisions as to what resources they need on a daily basis or specific to maybe certain travel. And so I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Laval. I'm actually located in British Columbia. And my co-presenter, who is not with us live, will have a short little video coming up to introduce himself. It was my supervisor actually for my PhD. I am, as you can see in the picture there, I'm a manual wheelchair user for about 35 years and have been involved a lot in things related to mobility and sport, tourism as it relates to accessibility. So deep background there, personal, professional, and academic.
Hey, Mike, just a moment, just so you know, we're seeing the presenter view instead of the full screen view.
It's not letting me now choose sharing.
I disabled my sharing, Mike. You should be able to share.
Well, the screen is it's one participant can share at a time. So if I show, is it still showing my presenter screen?
We're seeing you now. Are you able down at the bottom to push share screen again.
It's only giving me one participant can share at a time and multiple participants can share simultaneously.
Instead of clicking the little caret, just click the button, the big button that says share screen.
How about now? Is the video up?
Hi there, my name is Ben Mortenson, and I'm an occupational therapist by training and an associate professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So Mike asked me to talk to you today a little bit about the role of occupational therapists in community mobility.
Mike, I'm still not seeing your screen share.
Occupational therapists are heavily involved in assistive technology.
Sorry about this. How about now?
Yes, we see it now.
Technology provision and prescription. Hi there, my name is Ben Mortenson, and I'm an occupational therapist by training and an associate professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So Mike asked me to talk to you today a little bit about the role of occupational therapists in community mobility. So obviously, occupational therapists are heavily involved in assistive technology provision and prescription. So as part of that process, for me, the first step, and I hope everyone is doing, is to find out what are people's goals? What do they want to do with their lives? And I'm guessing that a lot of those goals revolve around community mobility, whether it's shopping or visiting with friends, whatnot. So having found out what people's goals are, the next step is to then try and trial different and train people using different kinds of assistive devices. So to do that, I would recommend thinking about the human activity assistive technology model, or HAT model. I think it's a very helpful way to think about things. So there's obviously the human. So what are their abilities? What are their preferences? There's the activities that they want to do. And remembering that all those activities are contextual. So you don't just shop in a vacuum, you shop at a place, a certain location. And so you may not be able to generalize a skill that you teach someone in the lab. You know, here's how you go over a lip. And doing that in a different environment can be totally different in the community. So really important thing to think about. And last is around the assistive technology. So say, for example, someone wasn't able to ambulate functionally. Well, we're probably going to think about giving them a wheelchair of some sort. Now, there's lots of different kinds of wheelchairs. So there's manual wheelchairs, there's power wheelchairs, there's scooters. And nowadays, there's lots of add-ons. Some of them are manual, some of them are powered. So there's a huge range of potential devices that we could think about for people. Obviously, one of the first things we want to do with people is if you're giving someone a wheelchair, you want to do a seating assessment. I'll be honest, I don't think that always happens, but it should. So we want to look at people's abilities, their balance, whether they've got hamstring tightness, their posture, all these kind of things, because obviously seating has a huge impact on people's mobility. Now, once you've done that and you thought, okay, well, I understand this person and their body, what are the devices then? And how could we then trial those devices? Well, I will back up a step, and just in terms of thinking about when you think, as soon as you're giving someone a device, all of a sudden there's potential accessibility issues, especially for their homes and vehicles. And so that's another area that occupational therapists are involved in. So potentially doing home modifications so that people can actually end up using the devices that we provide them, so that they don't end up sitting in the closet somewhere. So if you've, have gone through the process and figured out, well, this is, I think, the device people should be using, or this is the device they want to use, and you've come to some agreement there. And maybe it's more than one device. Depends on, obviously, funding has a big influence there, but maybe people use a power wheelchair for some things and a manual wheelchair for others if they've got the funding. That's great. So the next step is training. And I must be honest, I think that's one that sometimes gets overlooked. We know from the statistics that definitely there's a large proportion of people who use wheelchairs who are not trained in how to use them. And I think that's a real crime, because there's also very good research by Dr. Kirby showing the benefits of wheelchair skills training. That said, wheelchair skills training we provide is somewhat limited. We usually focus on physical mobility skills. So can you go up a curb? Can you go up a ramp? Can you do a wheelie? Those are all very important skills. But there are other skills that I think we should, as OTs, think about, or wheelchair prescribers more generally. So one of those skills I would argue is around wheelchair maintenance. My colleague Bonnie Skwatsky and myself and others have done research looking at wheelchair maintenance skill training. And we've shown that that's a potentially a valuable thing for people, and that people can learn these skills. There's also another skill, though, that I think is frequently overlooked is the way finding. So we focus a lot on the wayfaring, like how do you negotiate the environment that you're in? But a big component, an important consideration is, especially if you're in a novel environment, is how you get from point A to point B. And that whole planning process is something that I think we frequently overlook. And that's going to be the focus of much of today's chat with Mike. So thanks for joining me.
Okay, so just a quick introduction in terms of what I hope we can achieve today is looking at the mobility challenge, similar to what Ben has done in his introduction. And I like to use, I'm a bit of a cartographer in terms of my background as well. So I like to look at things in terms of the spatial context and using maps to understand my environment. And I think for people who use wheeled mobility devices, this is especially valuable because we end up not being able to go to a lot of places because we don't know what's there or is not there. So we'll look at creating how we could create mobility maps with clients and develop mobility plans that incorporate issues such as, whether or not they need wheelchair skills training, as Ben mentioned, or they need to try out different routes, maybe have add-ons that will allow them to accomplish the day-to-day activities that they personally plan on trying to do. So we kind of looked at this in one study where we asked people who use wheeled mobility devices to they would carry a GPS device with them and move about the community for a 2-week period, and it would collect data as to where they went. And what we found was that this gave us an idea of what their daily activity sort of spaces entailed. And the map that you see there sort of shows you the extent of our participants in British Columbia. The interesting thing to note about all of this is that two factors seem to make a big impact on the size of those circles, and were whether or not someone had access to a vehicle, and whether or not the neighborhood that they lived in was walkable. Now, so those two things kind of play against each other in some ways. If you have a car, you're able to go much further, and you'll have a bigger activity space. That's not necessarily great, because that could mean that in your community, either it's not walkable or it does not have what you need in your day-to-day life, and it forces you to go further in order to accomplish many of the activities that you want to do. So, but ultimately, we live, I think those in North America, we're car oriented, and having access to the car was it dominated. Even if you lived in a walkable neighborhood, you would still have large activity spaces. So there's some hints here as to what what destinations I might be able to get to based on my own resources. So I thought I would sort of put this out to the group, asking for any ideas of what you think that what key community mobility factors would affect wheelchair, whether manual or power wheelchair users or scooter users, from being able to move about the community. So yes, so snow and lack of curb cuts, I see vision deficits. I guess Cheryl there, when you talk about vision deficits, are you referring to the person having a vision deficit or sight lines? So we have sidewalks, obstacles and broken sidewalks, easy access to buildings, and slopes of ramps. So getting back to Cheryl, yep. So definitely, obviously, people who use mobility devices often have multiple disabilities, and vision being a very common one. So not having that ability to see as well as one want, but also sight lines, because in a wheeled mobility device, you're often much lower, and your other vehicles won't be able to see you. Steep hills, traffic, and garbage day. Yep. I personally will, if I know the neighborhood that I'm going to be traveling through, and I happen to know garbage day, I will often be on the street in suburban areas, because if you can never be sure what either getting around those trash cans or what they might leave behind. So that's great. And probably to no one's surprise, when we did another study, we brought in about 60 or 40 people who use wheel mobility devices, and asked them to list all the factors that they could think of that might impact their decision as to what route they would take to get to a destination. And so they came up with about 72 or so. They then grouped them together and rated them in terms of how important they were for them to be able to make those choices that I mentioned. And so interestingly, the way this approach works is it can aggregate everyone's groupings, and what they came up with were these 8 groupings, and each grouping has anywhere from 3 to about 8 individual, or 10 or 12 actually individual factors, and they were being ready to go, which referred to whether you're physically, mentally, and your device was ready to take on whatever challenge it was that you were about to take on. And then the planning component, which is what sort of Ben alluded to as one of the key aspects of it, which includes some degree of wayfinding, and that might depend on the trip context. So for someone who is going for a job interview, might want to take a very different route than someone who's just going to the store, because you might really be concerned about avoiding anything that's muddy paths and stuff like that, or you might want to minimize the amount of effort that you have to put out to get there, because you don't want to arrive at your interview all sweaty. And obviously things like time and distance and effort are critical to that. And then enjoying the trip, which what I didn't mention before is the height of these individual clusters determines for that cluster how important it was overall. And the enjoying the trip one was the lowest. And I would suggest, or I have a feeling that might have to do with the fact that for people with disabilities, they're often just happy to be able to get to the destination, and the ability to enjoy the trip is not high on the list. And as the environment improves, maybe that will change. And we had sidewalks and curb ramps, by far one of the most important. Traffic, avoiding heavy traffic and intersections, low lighting, which I think also speaks to the visual component. With obstacles, snow was very high. I know for those of you that when this was originally scheduled, thinking of going to Pittsburgh using a manual wheelchair in the winter time was not a great prospect from my perspective. But out here where I live, we rarely get snow except for this year. And then we've got health and safety, which was these were not high concerns, and the temperature. So for someone who's a quadriplegic, they're going to be very concerned about being out in the cold for very long. In fact, we're doing a project right now where we're asking people to wheel through parks, and we're having a very difficult time with recruitment during the winter, because as you would expect, people being outside for more than 30 minutes or so is not an attractive option. So I think what this group came up with is even more interesting, was that we look at how we get around the community from a journey experience approach. So we prepare for the trip, we make specific plans as how we're going to go about doing it, and then we can potentially enjoy it. And these tend to be impacted like from the orange boxes sort of relate more closely to impacting the phase that's sort of above them. So weather went into the preparation and planning much more than it apparently did when it comes to enjoyment, in terms of how people group things and whatnot. But and we also see that in this diagram, the items that are in bold there differentiate what someone with a manual chair versus someone who's using powered mobility, they would have differences. So it's not that everybody who's a wheeled mobility device user obviously has the same challenges. It's very personalized, and the factors that affect them are going to differ based on somewhat on that. In another study that I did, I tried to take someone to an unfamiliar environment. I had them plan a trip to a destination and then actually go through it. So they would get a researcher that would walk along with them so that they didn't go completely off track or down any kind of dangerous paths. But what we found was that people actually end up planning trips that were on average for everybody about 21% longer than the shortest possible route available. And while that's not always the best strategy, the shortest route isn't always the easiest route or the most enjoyable. It's hard to make any plans other than that based on most maps. You can just see, oh, this is the shortest line between two destinations. And that was the strategy most people said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. But they still started off already 21% further than that shortest route. And then even following those plans, they tended to go off their plan by about 16% on average, which meant in the end, upwards of 40% on average that people would travel further. So it's almost, doing 50%, knowing that you're going to be traveling 50% further is a deterrent in itself, and can lead to people just sort of giving up on the trip part way because they might get lost, or other issues might pop up. And two of those things are sort of a way of thinking about those factors in that other map was some things are barriers. So they're obstacles that force the person to take a different route, which will increase the distance, or it could simply be that you could have two paths of the same distance, but one's up a 10% slope, so it's going to have a greater burden. And so all these things are sort of playing out as people are moving through their communities and making those choices very difficult. In fact, a lot of the hazards that you might find on the ground, especially if you're a manual wheelchair user, I spend a lot of my time staring at the ground, worrying whether or not my casters will get caught in something. So I'm not able to see I don't get to take in what's around me in terms of enjoying it, or I might miss signs. So this person here, they missed one sign that ended up making they ended up traveling almost twice as long as they had that they needed to. So again, these are all things that will deter people from getting out into the community, reaching destinations where they want to do their day-to-day living. So one way to go about it was to look at how we could develop sort of a strategy for individuals to think about, okay, what is it that I want to do in my community? When do I want to do it? Where are those destinations located? What mode of travel might be necessary? So even though you may you may have like a doctor's office that's very far away and you don't have the choice of wheeling to that destination, and then looking at, okay, here are the ways I can get there, but what challenges exist along the way, so that ultimately we can have this final column on this on the brown table there, which is, what can we do to overcome those challenges? And as you build the maps out, hopefully you can start to see where you could focus assisting the person in engaging in their community more. And the way this works is you can, based on, I guess, your comfort with different mapping systems, one easy one is to use Google Earth, and that's the image that you see here, and to use that to sort of put pins on a map and then figure out routes in between those, and then looking at the satellite imagery that's available and using Street View, which a lot of people I think are quite comfortable with, to be able to look more closely at those routes and to try to figure out, okay, here's where some challenges exist and when they might exist. So something that in the daytime is going to be potentially different than in the nighttime because of visibility. So I start with a little case study, and again, feel free, I'll try my best to look at the chat along the way. So I developed a case study here where it's a young individual, senior in high school. She's just getting out of rehab. She's a very active person before, and she wants to remain active, very social, loves being in nature. She lives in a neighborhood that's a suburban neighborhood, which is a pretty basic transportation network, your classic grid street network. She does have access to her own vehicle, but she has to sort of like a family vehicle that she can use when needed. Does not enjoy transit, which is a very common thing. I personally despise getting on transit, do anything to avoid it. I would travel a couple extra kilometers rather than get on a bus in many cases. She's very fit and is willing to go those longer distances. So here, the first thing that we do is we go into Google Earth. I won't go too much into the details of the technology because it can change from one day to the next. But and you put a pin, figure out where she lives, put a pin in there, and then if you look at Street View here, you see she lives in an apartment building. What you might notice is there's no sidewalks in her neighborhood. It's an enclosed sort of an apartment complex, so they deemed sidewalks not that important. Traffic is somewhat minimal and slow, so it's relatively safe. So, some of the things that these are some of the destinations that Heather, the case study, deemed important for her. So she goes to school during the day and during the weekdays, obviously, and you can see that at the very top right pin. She likes to meet with friends and family on the weekends, and that's the bottom right pin. It's a coffee shop. She likes to go to the park on weekends, and that's just to the far left near her home, and accessing healthcare when required. So her healthcare, her doctor is, she either has to use her car or take transit if required. And fortunately, there's a bus stop that goes close to her doctor's office that's just around the block from her. But this doesn't really tell us, we can kind of get an idea of how far away things are, but it doesn't necessarily tell us whether these are feasible routes for her. So what I'm going to try to do is go into Google Earth while you watch my puppy dog. Okay. So hopefully you're seeing my map. And try not to get people nauseous doing this. So what you'll see here is you've got Heather's home on this map and where she goes to high school. So what you can do to figure out how she might get there using her wheelchair is you just right click here, go on her home, choose directions from here, right click on her high school, directions to here. And just like in Google Maps, it tries to figure out the shortest path. Now, I didn't choose pedestrian, so that's, I should have done that first. But I think you'll find that it won't be much different. So I make sure I go up and redo it. Directions from here, directions to here, and choose a person, and didn't change. So right now we've got one option. It's the shortest option, potentially. It's based on Google, so who knows how good it is. They have been talking about creating, or they have somewhat of an accessibility component to their mapping, and it's not very good at this point, as one might expect. And what I did find in a lot of the research too was that people did rely on, say, Google Maps to get around. But of course, all that gives you is the streets and stuff, so it doesn't have any information about sidewalks. So here we have Heather's route to school, and we can zoom in. And then if I want to consider whether or not this is actually a feasible route, I need to see more detail. And so a lot of those, the factors that came up in that cluster map and what a number of you have identified as challenges for getting around are the things that I'll be looking for. And I can do that by going into Street View, which is the little person, and hover it over a line. And so now I can start to see, okay, so this is what it looks like on the ground. And I'm able to probably identify a number of those factors. Some of them are much more difficult to figure out. There is the option of even seeing slopes and stuff like that, which I'll show in a minute. But what I would do then with the person, and I've done this many times myself when I'm going on vacation somewhere, I want to get an idea of the best routes to take, because again, you don't know where you might find some stairs or other obstacles along the way. So I won't do this too much, because I think it might get nauseating or not. So we start to see we've got a sidewalk on the left. There's nothing on the right. So I might add a pin. I go up to the add placemaker. I move the pin where I want it, and I might just type in. I might type in that sidewalk on left. Okay, that. And so I'll have these pins as I'm going through. I keep seeing these things. This is a pretty basic neighborhood where the features don't change much, but it's you get places, things like this, where you've got a cross slope here. It's really quite difficult to see on the even on the street view, but it's a parking lot, and it's quite common that they'll have this 10% slope instead of 2% slope. And again, here's one place where cross slope is one of the things I hate the most, because you end up pushing with one arm. And now this might not affect, this might not affect somebody in a powered mobility other than potential for tipping. But so I'll actually, I'll avoid either going down that street, or I'll push on the street itself. Now, this is a suburban neighborhood with not a lot of traffic, so I would probably do the latter. The other thing about another factor here, now it's not part of the route, is I can't stand these curb things to slow down cars, because they often don't leave enough width for you able to go over, and it's really easy to, as you're going over and you come back and you hit your front foot plate and tip forward. I did that, I think that was 2 days ago. So again, I'm looking in as I'm going through. I'm going to make notes by placing pins, and I'll end up creating a map. I'll go to the end here.
Mike, we do have a few questions in the chat if you
Yeah.
want to take a look at those now.
Okay. Okay, so we have from Steve about so I don't know if Steve can elaborate on that. I'm not sure I quite understand this. So these are the types of things that most seated clinicians think they understand, but truly don't. I say that someone who's a seating, okay, I understand. Absolutely. When it comes to whether or not you're using a rigid or foldable chair, that makes a huge difference. And as well, again, things that are hard to see on the map and satellite view is whether or not a surface is really rough, and to avoid that. Okay, so Project Sidewalk, great people that I've been talking with for the last couple of years. They have been, for those that aren't aware, they've created a crowdsourcing tool for identifying key elements of the pedestrian network where there are issues. I think it's a great start. Well, there's a number of other applications that have tried to do this. The challenge with these and many other related attempts at this is that they get started and they sort of peter out after a few years. So you can't really, it's really about critical mass of getting people to contribute to that. It's also, it's not something that really helps with being able to quickly identify a lot of options. So, which this is as well kind of, this approach is very personalized, but Project Sidewalk by crowdsourcing data about the pedestrian network hopefully would speed up that ability so that you wouldn't have to do as much here. You'd already have people potentially sharing this. So this could be something that itself was shared or embedded into accessibility navigation systems like that. Yeah, and the data of the image as well. I mean, the pedestrian environment, cities are somewhat slow for major changes. So things like slope aren't going to change too much over the years, but you're definitely going to have seasonal. You'll have the bane of my existence is any kind of sidewalk construction where they don't give you alert in the right place as to where you can avoid that. So you end up getting to a sign where there's construction, and the next thing you know, you have to track back a couple hundred meters, and again, that adds 400 meters to a trip that was only supposed to be 800 meters. And that is definitely a challenge. So these images are limited in that way. I think too, this is meant to give the person at least a starting point that they can then go out on their own and test out and to see if it works. It's not meant to be, here's definitely what your environment looks like, but it's a lot better than sitting at home and thinking, oh, I can't do it. Or, not being aware of a major challenge that exists. I know when I was first, I got to go home from the hospital at Christmas time once, and we had, I don't know, a couple of feet of snow. I was living out east, and I ended up getting into a little valley that had a 10% slope in either way. And I was on my own, and I think I weighed half my body weight and had no strength. And I would have been stuck in 10 degrees below zero weather in my wheelchair because I just decided to give this a chance, whereas I might have been able to notice this beforehand if I had done a bit of a mapping exercise. Mind you, this was before Google existed. And Andrea mentions Access Now. I think right now, the app is mainly about, and this is very common in all countries, is the app is really about buildings. And that's, again, it's valuable information. I think they're only starting to look at trails and stuff now. But I think the challenges there is whether or not they're doing it in a way that can allow people to ultimately make personal choices on things. So a lot of these apps, and I'm not saying Access Now or Project Sidewalk is doing this necessarily, is that they'll say what's accessible and what's not. And that's just, there's no such thing really as accessible at a generic level. And there's just some challenges in terms of being able to scale that up to at a broader scale so that broader communities could take advantage of that data. But I guess we'll see on that. So going back to the route here, we'll just get to the very end here. I don't want to. So one common thing is that she comes around the corner and first of all, here's the sidewalk, and I would again chime in if how you would what issues you might see with this curb ramp and crosswalk. So this is going to a street that doesn't have a sidewalk at all. And I don't think I can zoom in there. Sorry. So the big problem here is a lot of curb ramps a crosswalk is supposed to have a sidewalk landing, a curb ramp, and a street landing, and then a crosswalk. Inevitably, even in brand new developments, and maybe it might be a little bit different with the United States with the ADA. I mean, we have an ACA here in Canada, but it doesn't really get down to these kind of things. This is still a sort of a municipal responsibility. They basically combine the curb ramp and the sidewalk at the same time. So when you go up the curb ramp, you have to immediately turn. You can't get to a sort of a resting spot before you change directions. And that's not as huge a deal when you're coming up the ramp, but when you're going down the ramp, you can't really go on there. And so your cars will see you and think, oh, you're not crossing, or you're crossing the other direction, because you have to line up your chair in a way that will not go down the curb ramp. And in a neighborhood like this, it's not a big deal, but when you get into a bigger city, you don't want those kind of things happening. And I don't know, for those of you living in different regions, how it is in where you are, but I find that to be a very common and very, very dangerous thing. So here's where we might start talking about, chair skills that are required to be able to safely reach a destination. It also, the fact that there's no sidewalks, another thing here is, well, the temporal nature of Heather's day-to-day activities are going to school. She might, in the morning, this might be fine, but coming home, she might be participating in activities and coming home after dark. So it would be essential that she would have either clothing that cars would be able to see her, or a light. I often travel around with a light, like a bike light, if I'm going out in the evening. So here, this, hopefully everyone's seeing this map. The map shows what that route looks like, and it also shows what you can do in Google Earth is you can right click on the route and show the elevation profile. And while I would, the accuracy of this is debatable, it does give you somewhat of an idea. Now, this neighborhood is very flat, I know, because I live near it. So it looks a slightly more bumpy, more hilly than it is. It actually shows you how far the trip is. So this one is it's about a mile, and the maximum slopes are between 7% and -8%. It's probably half that in reality, but again, it gives you a general idea and allows you to at least make somewhat of an informed decision on that. And this map shows you where some of those pins that I dropped on the map would show up. Here's one of the issues was the crosswalk, another crosswalk, and this one is crossing a very busy street. What you have here is a sort of a blind turn to a certain degree. You've got sidewalks that are not aligned, so you end up having to actually, because when I take on a curb ramp, I take it on at 90 degrees. That means I'm going to have to pull around and into traffic somewhat in order to get up that ramp. It's even worse on the other side. And again, the same thing with the sidewalk landing isn't really a sidewalk landing. Another one of her routes that factors that she has to deal with is the trip to the park is going up moderately steep slopes and very soft surfaces. So in the end, the idea is to hopefully start to build out this sort of a community mobility strategy where you have listed all the things that you want to do. And again, when you want to do it, where it's located, what options you have in terms of your travel, and then that last part, which is where a lot of the work happens, either using the maps or actually going out and trying to do that. Maybe it means going with friends and family so that you don't do like me and get stuck, to be able to explore these neighborhoods. Because I think a lot of the challenges for people using wheeled mobility devices is that they don't know what might be accessible, or there might be one link in the route that creates this inaccessibility, and if only that were fixed, they would be it would open them up to so much more. So at least that this would draw that awareness, and maybe they can go to the municipality and say, you really need to put in a curb ramp here, or fix, or if you're going to a park, they like to put the chain links fence so that stops cars, but it also starts, but it isn't meant to stop someone who's walking through, but it does potentially stop someone who's in a mobility device. But again, in the end, with this, being able to build this strategy is by looking at that last column and looking at all the things that might be beneficial for this person in order to be able to participate more. And so we might have noted that wheelchair skills and training might have been helpful, finding alternate routes at night. If they're going to the market, for instance, that they're probably going to want a basket for underneath, because carrying stuff on your back is not very comfortable. For the park, it might be an add-on for the front end of the chair for her to lift the casters up. I was going to do a second one, but I think we'll go over that. What I will say about this situation is an older gentleman who's going to is retired in a completely new neighborhood, knows nothing about it, but it's a very dense neighborhood. And one of the challenges is not, I mean, there's definitely physical challenges, but there are also wayfinding challenges. And this person may have some cognitive decline that makes getting lost more likely. And so that might, again, that might be, you might have a mapping exercise where the person actually has a physical map with them at all times so that they can feel confident that wherever they might be in this quite dense network, that they'll be able to find their way home. And again, same thing here, do the same kind of approach, but there'll be different issues. And ultimately that strategy will be based on the personalized challenges that person has within that spatial context. So before we go to full questions, in conclusion, it's, being able to navigate the pedestrian environment is critical. Whether or not it's the only way you're getting around or one that connects you to transit, or when you leave your car, you have to go from the car to the building or to the park. It's always going to be a part of a journey, and it's really important that the individual can handle the physical aspects of the wayfaring and the more cognitive elements of the wayfinding. Developing these community mobility plans can help people hopefully develop those strategies to address those challenges. And it might be that some minor mapping skills, whether it's an occupational therapist or a rec therapist, or even just building those skills in the individual, they may come to you with already having those, having that that strategy at the end is having a conversation to be able to understand the best ways of ensuring greater participation. And I shall end there, which means, okay.
Do we have any questions for Mike? Oh, we've got a question from Heather.
Yep. Okay, lessening burden. Well, the first thing, and this is what my last 10 years of my graduate work has been focused on, is exactly your question, is it starts with information, in my opinion, as you, I think, I haven't read the full question here. Yeah, so is a lot about information. Even knowing where I can't go is just as important as to where I can go. And it's funny because I have your mention of John, as I've been in deep talks with him over the last 2 months. But there's that, and then figuring out, getting also municipalities on board, because a lot of those apps are great starts, but they need to be adopted by cities, and they need to take into consideration the fact that the city is always changing at the in terms of like construction and stuff like that. Because like I think I mentioned earlier, a lot of my challenges that I face relate more to the temporary infrastructure, those issues. So I don't know when there's going to be construction. I had 2 years ago, they decided to do the sidewalks at both ends of my street. So if I weren't, like, I'm able to walk, if I weren't able to walk, I would be completely trapped in my building unless I had a car. And there was just no thought about that. So there's information about accessibility so that people can make choices that where they can avoid burden, avoid barriers, lessen burden, and cities can make better choices as to how to improve that. Because that's the other side of it, is I think planning departments don't really understand that. They'll end up like, somebody will complain that they need a curb cut in their neighborhood, and they'll jump on that, but they'll only have the ability to do, say, 10 of them in the year. that might not have been the best use of that money. So again, that information allows planning departments to make much more strategic decisions about how to improve the pedestrian environment. And some cities are all over that. And where I live in BC is the exact opposite. I fight the engineering department all the time about how to do this in a more strategic way. So it's seeing things like Project Sidewalk it's great, and I hope that that buy-in that you're talking about, and that again, more government involvement, or even private business really gets behind this, because ultimately it's good for everyone. If I can get around, I can go to your store and buy stuff. I can get to school and get my education. So it's a win-win for everybody in that regard.
Any other questions? All right, I'm going to go ahead and give out the CEU code. If anyone has a question, certainly go ahead and type it into the chat now. The CEU code is KRGLEN, and I'm going to put that into the chat as well. Well, if no one has anything else, Mike, thank you very much for the presentation this afternoon. Morning for you, I think.
And Heather, say hi to John for me.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.